Biology 1, third and fourth quarter review of concepts, part 2. In this part, we're going to look at classification, plants, and animals. These are the kingdoms of life. Remember, there's 6 kingdoms. 2 are bacterial. We have the bacteria kingdoms of eubacteria and archaebacteria. Remember, they're both prokaryotes, which means they have no nucleus and no membrane-bound organelle, like mitochondria and Golgi apparatus. However, remember, all cells have a ribosome or many ribosomes for making proteins, which carry out life processes in the form of enzymes. Eubacteria is the kingdom that has members that can cause human disease, like E. coli. There are some strains of it that can cause disease. Streptococcus causes strep throat. Bacteria also can be autotroph or heterotroph, and they're all unicellular. So if they're single-celled, they could be a bacteria. If they're single-celled and have no nucleus, they're definitely a bacteria. Archaebacteria are the extremophiles. They're the ones that can live in extreme environments, like the bottom of the ocean, as well as salt flats, like in Salt Lake City, and other extreme environments like the Arctic areas. So let's go through this one at a time. Eubacteria, all are prokaryotes, means no nucleus. They do have DNA, they just don't have a membrane structure surrounding the DNA. That's called the nucleus. They all are made of one cell. Some are autotrophs, others are heterotrophs. Blue-green algae would be an example of an autotrophic eubacteria. You don't have to know that. Most are not harmful and act as decomposers, so most bacteria won't cause human disease. However, some eubacteria do cause human disease. Probably the most famous one would be the black plague, Yersinia pestis, staphylococcus, staph infections, pneumonia, gonorrhea, syphilis, all bacterial infections that are curable by antibiotics. However, some bacteria are not able to be killed by our antibiotics because they're evolving faster than we're able to make weapons to destroy them. Then we have protists. They're not bacteria. They do have a nucleus, membrane-bound structure for their DNA. They're eukaryotic. Most are unicellular, however, some are multicellular, like algae. If you see seaweed, that's not a true plant. That's a type of protist, type of algae. Some of the autotrophs have chloroplast, while others are heterotrophic. We have some that cause disease in humans, like Plasmodium. This one causes malaria, and Giardia. That one gives you diarrhea. They're difficult to cure because they are eukaryotes, and you're a eukaryote, so things that kill them also kill us. Protists can reproduce sexually and asexually, so they don't necessarily have to have a male or female to reproduce by binary fission or dividing in two. Some of the uses of protists are in algae. As algae, we use that to make ice cream in agar. Kind of gives it its jelly-like texture. Fungus, all are heterotrophs, which means that they cannot make their own food. They cannot use the sunlight and carbon dioxide in the air to make their glucose and other organic molecules. They have to get it from other dead animals or plants. They can eat living things. In that case, they're parasites. If you have a infection in your foot, if you have athlete's foot, then that's a parasitic fungus. Also, the dead, the ones that feed on the dead, are called saprophytes. All are eukaryotic, which means they all have a nucleus. Most are multicellular, like a mushroom. Some are unicellular, like yeast. They can reproduce asexually or sexually. When the mushroom produces spores, that spore, which is not a zygote, it's not a fertilized egg, will produce a whole new structure in the fungus life cycle. So that would be asexual reproduction. There's also sexual reproduction. There's male and female gametes. The sperm and egg fuse together to form zygotes, so both go on in fungus. Includes mushrooms and yeast, and we use fungi for making bread, that's yeast, antibiotics, penicillin is a type of fungus, and beer. Plants are all multicellular. They're all eukaryotic. That means they have a nucleus. They all make their own food. They're autotrophs. They have cell walls made of cellulose. They have chloroplast inside for doing photosynthesis. They also reproduce sexually and asexually. Especially the simpler plants, like mosses, have a whole part of their life cycle that's asexual. Examples include moss, ferns, cacti, grass, and trees, and we use it, of course, for things like building, medicine. Aspirin comes from the bark of a willow tree, food, dyes, paper, etc. So now we have to have some more details about plants, and you should know the information on this slide. There's 4 divisions, 4 phylums of plants: bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Bryophytes are usually close to the ground. They don't have any vascular tissue, no tubes for transport of water. They don't have any pollen, seeds, fruits, or flowers. They're the simplest plants. Here we have moss over here. They reproduce by flagellated sperm that have to swim through the water in the ground, and that's how the reproduction takes place in bryophytes. Same way in pteridophytes. Pteridophytes are the ferns. They also include things like ginkgo, and here's an example of fern up here. They don't produce pollen. They have flagellated sperm, swims through the water. They don't have any seeds or fruits or flowers. They do have tubes. They have xylem and phloem for transport, so they can grow fairly tall. Gymnosperms, think pine trees, needle trees. They do not produce fruits or flowers. However, they do produce pollen for transferring the male gametes, the sperm, from one plant to another. Also, the cone, the woody cones on a pine tree or other needle trees, other conifers, are the reproductive structures, and they have seeds inside. So once the pollen lands on the female pine cone, which is woody, the sperm burrows in and fertilizes the egg, and then the pieces of the cone fall off, and each one can become a whole new plant, a whole new tree. In gymnosperms, we also have pollen, which is a lightweight structure that contains the male gametes inside and is a adaptation for living on land. We can spread our gametes, if you're a plant, by wind or animals instead of having to rely on water, as tridophytes and bryophytes have to with flagellated sperm. The angiosperms include the flowering plants, includes most of the plants you see outside that are not the needle trees. That includes things like maple trees, grass, tulips. They have flowers, and that's where reproduction takes place. The flower is basically, the petals are advertisement in pollinators like bees and birds, and then once those bees and birds get a sip of nectar, the pollen sticks to their body, they go to another flower, the pollen drops off, and that's how the male gametes are spread from plant to plant. Once the pollen lands on another flower, it turns into two sperm, travels down, fertilizes the egg, other sperm fertilizes the food supply called the endosperm, and that's basically what goes on in a seed. All right, alternation of generations. There's a sexual part of the life cycle of plants. We have gametes, we have sperm and egg, but there's also an asexual portion of the life cycle where the plant makes something called spores, and these spores can become part of the plant or a whole new plant by itself. For example, over here we have the fern, sporophyte, which is the two sets of chromosome part of their life cycle. Every cell has two sets of chromosomes. However, in their haploid part of their life cycle, where they reproduce asexually without sex, they only produce this little structure here. And this structure here, this heart-like fern, is actually a second part of the life cycle of a fern. This part here makes the gametes, they fertilize, they come together to form a zygote, and we're back at the diploid sporophyte. All right, so step one, we have to get the pollen to the flower and eventually into the ovary and the ovule inside. So pollination is the process of getting pollen from one flower to another. The second step is fertilization. We have the sperm fertilizing the egg inside the ovule that will become the seed. And then the last step is called germination. Germination is when the plant actually sprouts from the seed, doing a lot of mitosis, and that zygote inside doing cell division. Flower parts, you should know this. Carpel, that's the female part of the plant. Stigma is the landing pad for pollen. Style is just the neck that leads to the ovary. The ovary will become the fruit in an angiosperm. So the apple developed from the ovary. Within the ovary are ovules. These ovules become the seeds. So when you eat something like an apple, the ovules within the flower of the apple plant became the seeds, and the outside ovary became the fruit of the apple. Now the male part is called the stamen. That's easy to remember. There's men in the name. Anther is the top that produces the pollen grains, and the pollen is the male part of the plant. The eggs are, of course, the female part of the plant. A filament just kind of holds the anther up, so it's more easy for things like birds to bump into. All right, pollination, getting pollen from the flower, the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. And two methods are wind, pollen is small and light, and animals. Bees and butterflies are attracted to the nectar, and the sticky pollen hitches a ride to another flower. This is a Rafflesia plant that smells like dead meat, and that attracts flies as the pollinator. And this exists in South America. All right, remember the fruit is a mature ovary. We have the ovules become the seeds, and then the ovary becomes the fruit. And even things like beans are technically a fruit because they have seeds inside. So once we form our seeds and our fruit, how do we distribute those seeds and fruits to avoid having competition for resources, to spread our traits or our species throughout a forest if you're a plant? Well, these are the four ways. So in a fleshy fruit producing plant, what we have is a trick to get animals to eat it, like apples and bananas, and then the seeds aren't broken down by the digestive system, and when the animal goes deposits their feces in the forest in a faraway location, the seeds are inside, and that's how the plant spreads its seeds to faraway locations. And there might be no other plants in that area, so that plant might be able to colonize that area if nothing else is there. Light fruits like helicopter seeds and dandelion seeds, they're very lightweight. They don't rely on animals to spread. They rely on wind to carry the seeds far away. Low density doesn't mean lightweight. It means it's less dense than water typically. Low density seeds include things like coconuts that float on the water, and that's how those desert islands get colonized by plants, is the seeds float on the currents and taken away to faraway islands. Then we have hooks on seeds, burrs and thistles. They get stuck to animals' fur, and that's how the plant spreads its species to faraway locations. All right, this is called a cladogram. Remember, cladograms show evolutionary relationships from back in time, and where we have a branching point is a common ancestor. So as we go further and further back in time, we get to simpler and simpler animals until we get to the simplest animals of them all. The simplest animals are the sponges. The next simplest are the cnidarians, and they're the oldest ones that we find in the fossil record. We find cnidarian sponge fossils in older fossil record layers than annelids and arthropods. We find annelids and arthropods in older fossil record layers than chordates and echinoderms. Sponges are the only one with no symmetry at all, and we're going to talk about each one of these in turn, but this is just showing the relationship of all the 9 major phyla of animals on this planet. All right, remember what a circulatory system is? It's a way of delivering nutrients and oxygen to all the cells of the body. There's 2 types of circulatory systems. We have open or closed. In an open circulatory system, the blood doesn't stay in the tubes, and we don't have that. We have a closed circulatory system. Insects, like grasshoppers, have an open circulatory system, so after they eat, their broken down food enters their bloodstream, and then the blood leaves their tubes and just kind of mixes in with their body fluids. Their body fluid and their blood is not different. It's the same. That's an open circulatory system, and things like insects have that. Now, the problem with this is that you have to rely on diffusion after the blood leaves the tubes, and that's not as efficient as a closed circulatory system. Now, all vertebrates have a closed circulatory system. That includes fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. So we have a closed circulatory system. The advantage of a closed circulatory system is the red blood cells stay in the tubes. So if we have the blood cells staying in the tubes, we can deliver stuff right up to the cells of our body, and there doesn't have to be a lot of diffusion to occur to get stuff from the blood to the cells of our body. So a closed circulatory system is more efficient than an open circulatory system, and that's what we have. In fact, without an open or without a closed circulatory system, birds and mammals probably wouldn't be able to maintain their high metabolism. All right, we have some different types of heart chambers in different types of vertebrates. The fish have a 2-chambered heart, amphibians have a 3-chambered heart, reptiles have a 3-chambered heart, and birds and mammals have a 4-chambered heart. For amphibians and reptiles, they have 2 atria and 1 ventricle. Even here with the reptiles, the ventricle is not completely separated, so it's considered 3 chambers. Digestive systems, most animals have a complete digestive system, or they have an in-hole for food and an out-hole for waste. This allows you to keep on taking in food from your environment without having to get rid of waste first, like in a one-opening digestive system that things like jellyfish have. So what are some evolutionary trends for land animals, terrestrial animals? Well, internal fertilization is selected for on land because if you have external, or if the sperm and egg are outside the body, they dry out. You're not going to be able to do that on a dry land environment because once that fertilized egg dries up, it's going to die. Eggs with water impervious shell, that means water can't get inside the shell or outside the shell. So when things like reptiles and birds lay eggs, the water inside is going to not evaporate because of the eggs with that shell. There's also a food supply in that egg as well that will keep that development going of whatever's inside. And then we have external versus internal respiratory surfaces. Surfaces that are respiratory have to be moist all the time, so we have internal respiratory surfaces to keep that happening. If we did not, if we had gills like fish that are exposed to external environment, then they would dry out and we wouldn't be able to live on land. So inside or internal respiratory surfaces are what land animals have in order to prevent drying out. Think in terms of preventing drying out for many of the land adaptations versus water. endothermy versus ectothermy. An endotherm means it's a warm-blooded animal, and ectotherm means it's a cold-blooded animal. There's only two types of animals on this planet that are endothermic. It's the birds and mammals. And they're always very active because they can maintain their internal environment. Regardless of the external temperature, they're able to maintain their chemical reactions at a higher rate. They're able to break down glucose faster, and that's going to release more heat as a byproduct. If they have more heat, they can have the chemical reactions happen at a faster rate. When you heat up a chemical reaction, it speeds up, and that's why birds and mammals are more active even in the winter. They're not sluggish. Ectotherms are animals that cannot control their internal body temperature and rely on the outside environment to control it for them. So when it gets cold out, things like lizards, snakes, amphibians like frogs, they all get very sluggish because they have no ability to control their own body temperature, speed up the chemical reactions within their bodies, and become more active. So, to recap, endotherms, warm-blooded, birds and mammals, able to maintain a high level of activity even in cold temperatures. Ectotherms means cold-blooded, means every other animal, reptiles, amphibians, fish, insects, all those other phyla. Those all cannot control their body temperature, so the outside environment controls it for them, and some of them have behaviors to help them warm up or cool down depending on the outside environment. All right, invertebrates versus vertebrates. The prefix in means not, so invertebrate means not a vertebrate or an animal with a backbone. Vertebra are the bones that surround your spinal cord. So if you're a vertebrate, you have the backbone, the bones of your spine, around your spine, and then you also have the spinal cord itself protected within. Most animals are invertebrates, and if you remember, we have 9 animal phyla that are major, and most of those animal phyla did not have a backbone. In fact, the only one that does are the chordates, which include fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Animal body tissues and multicellularity. Why be multicellular? Well, if you're one-celled, you have to do all the jobs with that one cell in order to survive. And there's nothing specialized in that one cell. If you're a bacteria, you might have some structures for movement, things like cilia and flagella to move through the water. However, you're not going to do anything very quickly or anything very effectively because only one cell can't do that much. However, multicellular organisms, such as us, have specialized groups of cells that have the same function. For example, we have muscle cells that have actin and myosin protein inside that slide past each other so that we can move our body very quickly, much, much quicker than one cell could. Types of symmetry. Now, there's only one type of animal that has no symmetry at all, or no one side that's in a mirror image of the other side, and that's the Porifera, the sponges. Cnidarians and echinoderms, the jellyfish, Cnidarians, and echinoderms, which are the starfish, both have radial symmetry. Radial means that you can slice it through a center point at some point, and each one of the slices will be a equal shape as the other slices, as you can see here in this picture. Now, if it's not radial symmetry and it's not no symmetry, it's bilateral symmetry. And everything else on this planet has bilateral symmetry, where one side of the body is a mirror image of the other side. Insects, crabs, worms, humans, reptiles, birds, all those things have bilateral symmetry. Now, skeletons provide muscle attachment points for movement and also support for the body. Imagine if you didn't have any bones inside, what would happen? You'd be like a pile of flesh and you wouldn't be able to really do very much. Hydrostatic skeletons are the skeletons of worms and other animals like jellyfish, as well as things like squid, where there's water pressure on the inside of the body that provides rigidity to the body itself. To try to help you understand what's going on here, think of like a water balloon. If you fill up a balloon with water, the water pressure on the inside kind of gives the balloon some rigidity or kind of structure to it. And that's kind of what a hydrostatic skeleton is. Basically water-filled body cavities and pressure on the inside of the body that gives the worm or the other animal shape. Exo means outside. Skeleton is a support structure, so exoskeleton is an outside support structure. Now, for things like insects and other animals that are arthropods or have an exoskeleton, the outside skeleton not only provides a muscle attachment point for movement, but also protection and support. Things like a turtle shell are not considered an exoskeleton because they're not muscle attachment points for movement. That's just called a shell. Another example of something that has a shell but not an exoskeleton would be something like a clam or an oyster. The clam or oyster is a shell. It's not a muscle attachment point, really, and it only provides protection. The endoskeleton is an inside skeleton. That's what we have. In fact, all chordates have an endoskeleton, inside skeleton that's lightweight. It's lighter than an exoskeleton. It's estimated that if insects were the size of humans, their exoskeleton, because it would be much heavier, there's a lot more of it, it would crush that insect. There would be a greater pull of gravity. For an endoskeleton, it's much lighter. However, you don't get any outside protection, so there is a downside to it. All chordates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds, have an endoskeleton. The reason why it's a skeleton is because it also provides a muscle attachment point for movement. Okay, we talked about that. So how do ectotherms or cold-blooded animals do it? If you're a warm-blooded animal, here we have an endotherm. We got the bobcat. Even when it's cold out, even up down to like 5 degrees Celsius, which is almost freezing, that bobcat still has a high body temperature. It's because the internal burning of the glucose and other molecules it's using for energy generates heat as a waste product, which keeps the chemical reactions going faster because hotter chemical reactions happen faster and slower. Snakes, however, when it gets cold out, take a look at what's happening to that body temperature. It's just dropping like a rock. And once it gets very cold out, then their body temperature gets very low and they're very sluggish. If you ever wanted to deal with snakes or handle them, put them in the freezer or refrigerator for a few minutes until their body temperature drops down pretty low, and then they'll be much more easy to deal with because they are not able to move quickly because they are cold-blooded. Right, so let's go ahead and review some of the different phyla, and these are some of the key characteristics of the 9 phyla that you should know about. Porifera are the simplest animals. There's no body symmetry. That's the only phyla with no body symmetry. No true tissues. They don't have groups of specialized cells that do the same function. They only move in the larval form, but not as an adult. They're stationary as a coral reef or a sponge as an adult. Most of them are filter feeders with no respiratory, digestive, or circulatory system. They just take in water through the little holes and filter out the good stuff, the nutrients that are found in the water. An example would be the sponges. Cnidarians are the jellyfish. It includes other things in addition to jellyfish. Many have stinging cells on their tentacles called nematocysts. They are predators. They are the simplest predators on this planet. There's no centralized brain. There's no specialized organs for respiration, circulation, or digestion. They rely on simple diffusion to get stuff from point A to point B. Their cell layers are very thin, however, so the food doesn't have to move very far. They have a hydrostatic skeleton, like worms, includes jellyfish and sea anemones. Platyhelminthes, think flat worms, so that's one way to help you remember it. Some are parasites, like tapeworms, and they have a gastrovascular cavity. They're one of the simplest animals without a complete digestive system. They only have one hole for their food, and they have to get rid of the undigested waste through the same hole. So that's not as efficient as a complete digestive system with an in-hole and an out-hole. They don't have any respiratory or circulatory system. They rely on diffusion to get oxygen and other things into their body. Nematoda, think nemesis, as many of these cause human disease. An example would be things like smooth roundworms like Ascaris. They have a complete digestive system. They're the simplest animal with a complete digestive system, and that means they have an in-hole and an out-hole, a mouth and an anus. There's no respiratory system. They breathe right through the skin, and they have a hydrostatic skeleton. Examples include Ascaris, which is a smooth parasitic worm that inhabits the intestines of people and other animals. We have pinworms. They hook onto the anus as they leave the body, and it's kind of gross how they check for that. Trichinella is a type of nematode that is found in uncooked pork, and the eggs hatch if you eat that uncooked pork, and they can burrow throughout the body. Phylum Mollusca. Most have an open circulatory system, which means the blood leaves the tubes. However, some of the predators have a closed circulatory system because it's more efficient. Now, why it's selected for is because without a closed circulatory system, these squids and octopi would never have made it to be the predators they are if they didn't have that thing going on for them. Squids and octopus are also mollusks, but most of them are things like clams, oysters, snails, things with a shell. All of them have soft bodies, even if they have a shell, and no skeleton. Many have 1 foot for moving. For example, snails and clams move with their 1 foot. Many have shells. Many are filter feeders. Things like clams and oysters just filter the water, and the nutrients in the water they filter out. Most have gills for a gas exchange, oxygen from the water, and a complete digestive system, in-hole and out-hole. And just as a side note, octopi are probably the smartest invertebrates on this planet. Annelida, think Anna the earthworm. These are the segmented roundworms, so they have little segments, not to be confused with the smooth roundworms, which is Nematoda. They breathe through their skin. They have a closed circulatory system. They're the simplest animal where the blood stays in the tubes. Annelids, like earthworms, have a closed circulatory system, blood with blood in the tubes. They also have the complete digestive system. They have an in-hole and an out-hole. Some are on top of euparasites or ectoparasites like leeches. Earthworms help put holes in the soil so oxygen can get into the roots. Even roots have to do cell respiration. And they have a hydrostatic skeleton. Annelida includes earthworms and leeches. All right, the biggest phylum on this planet, Phylum Arthropoda. These are animals with a jointed appendage. See the joints here? That just means a place where you can bend the leg. And they have an exoskeleton or an outside skeleton for protection and a muscle attachment point. The three major classes under Phylum Arthropoda: Crustacea, Arachnida, Insecta. Crustacea, think things like crabs, lobsters, even pill bugs, are more closely related to crabs than arachnids and insects. Crustaceans have two body parts. They have their head fused to the thorax up here. You can kind of see that. So this part here consists of one body part, the head and thorax, and then they have an abdomen, which is their back end. Now, for things like lobsters, that back end is very tasty, and of course people pay a lot of money for that. They usually have more than 8 legs, and most of them, but not all of them, live in the water. Arachnida, we have two body parts, like the crustaceans. The head and thorax are kind of fused together into one, and then we have an abdomen. And then we also have 8 legs in spiders. Insects have 3 body parts, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and 6 legs. Includes things like flies, roaches, beetles, bees, ants, etc. And just as an FYI, Insecta is the biggest class under the biggest phylum under Kingdom Animalia. Then we have phylum Echinodermata. Echinodermata is the only phylum that is invertebrate and also deuterostome. No backbone, but has a digestive system that starts with an anus first instead of the mouth, just like us chordates. Echinoderms include things like starfish. The name means rough skin. Echino means rough. Skin is dermata. They have bilateral symmetry as a larva. However, as an adult, they have radial symmetry. Remember, the only other animal with radial symmetry is the Cnidarians, the jellyfish. They have skin for respiration and an open circulatory system and a complete digestive system. Many can regrow limbs, which is an interesting side note about echinoderms, and include things like sea cucumbers, starfish, and sand dollars. And then the last phylum that's a major phylum on this planet is Phylum Chordata. All members of Phylum Chordata have a dorsal spinal cord, and most of them also have bones covering them called vertebra. The 5 major classes of Phylum Chordata are Osteichthyes, the bony fish, cold-blooded, 2-chambered heart, gills. Amphibia, they're ectotherm, cold-blooded, 3-chambered heart, skin or lung breathing. Things like frogs can breathe right through the skin, so they don't drown underwater as long as there's oxygen dissolved in the water. Reptilia, the reptiles, are also cold-blooded, 3-chambered heart. They have lungs. They cannot breathe through their skin. Things like alligators stick their nostrils above the water to avoid drowning. And they have soft-shelled eggs as a survival advantage on land. Then we have phylum, or rather class Aves, which are endothermic, which means that they're warm-blooded. All birds are warm-blooded. They have a 4-chambered heart. All birds have feathers. That's one way to definitely recognize a bird. And they have lungs and a hard-shelled egg that also prevents water loss. The yolk is a food supply inside that egg for the developing bird. And then we have class Mammalia. All mammals are warm-blooded, have a 4-chambered heart, lungs, hair, that's something that gives away a mammal, milk, and most, but not all, give birth to live young. Now, if you're a placental animal, that means you have an umbilical cord attached to the inner lining of your uterus called a placenta. And most of the mammals are placental. That includes us. Some have a pouch, so when a kangaroo gives birth, a marsupial, the developing offspring climb into the pouch and complete their development within the pouch. And then we have the smallest group of mammals called the monotremes, and that includes the platypus found only in Australia. That's where they evolved, and that's where they are basically stuck. Platypus are the only ones that are mammals and give birth to young in the form of eggs. So not all mammals produce live young. Some produce eggs, like the platypus. All right, there's a hierarchy of organization in living things that you should be familiar with. Cells make up tissues. A group of tissues that have the same function make up organs. A group of organs make up an organ system. And then the organ system makes up the organism. So a tissue is a group of cells with a common structure and function. For example, muscle tissue is a bunch of muscle cells that all involve themselves with contracting and moving the organism. Organs like the stomach are a combination of tissues. We have nervous tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue or covering, all found in this organ called the stomach. All your organs are combinations of these four tissues. Which brings us to the last part that you have to know for your test tomorrow, the 4 tissue types. The 4 tissue types are epithelial. Epithelial is just a covering, which makes up mainly your skin, but also covering your organs and lining the respiratory system as well as digestive system. We have muscle tissue. The main type is skeletal, connecting to bones, move your body around. Cardiac, only found in the heart. And smooth muscle, which is found in the digestive tract as well as the uterus of females. Connective tissue holds things together and also make up the framework of your body. Includes bone, cartilage, which is found in your nose and ear, fibers like tendons and ligaments. Remember, tendons connect muscle to bone, ligaments bone to bone, and blood is a connective tissue, connecting the nutrient absorption of the small intestine to all the cells of the body, connecting the lungs, oxygen exchange to all the cells of the body too. Then the nervous system takes in stimuli from the external environment. You can see and respond. And then you respond to that environment. You can send a nerve impulse down through your spinal cord to your legs to run away from a bear if that's what you're doing. The main functional unit of the nervous system is called the neuron. All right, so all these body systems are interrelated and they're connected. The circulatory system connects all the body systems together. Remember, digestion's all about breaking down stuff with enzymes, and there's 2 types of digestion, chemical and mechanical. Mechanical is mainly chewing food, chemical is using enzymes. The circulatory system delivers things via the blood, and remember, arteries go away from the heart, veins go toward the heart, and we have a 4-chambered heart. The right side of the heart is oxygen poor, the left side is oxygen rich. The functional unit of the respiratory system is the alveoli, and that's where we exchange gases. Basically, carbon dioxide diffuses from high to low concentration into the lungs. Oxygen diffuses from high to low concentration into the blood. Remember that we have 3 types of cells in our blood. Red blood cells, which have hemoglobin, a protein that carries oxygen throughout your body. You also have white blood cells that are involved with defense of your body. They can engulf invaders and destroy them. And then we have platelets, which clot any cuts in your body and plugs up any holes to prevent from bleeding to death. The excretory system is involved with pulling out metabolic waste like urea from your blood and getting rid of it through the bladder and then eventually the urethra. This ends part 2 of your review for your final exam 4th quarter.